Hello, humans. I'll say a few things about conservative governments of the 50s, 60s, and the relationship between number 10 and number 11. I think about the Conservative Chancellors. I've said before, there's a reason for doing this. There are six of them in 13 years. And I also think it will begin to show some of the basic problems of making economic policy, which is central to governments, I think, of the late 20th century, that will recur pretty much right up to now. I mean, just recently we've had Chancellor resign because number 10 trying to exercise control over him. So, these themes are also actually pretty up to date as well. Before we go to the Chancellors per se, I think it's worth reflecting on a fact. That is, we often tend to think prime ministers are kind of all powerful. And actually, it's funny enough, I was watching Yes, Prime Minister last night. We're watching them all through again. If you haven't watched them before, do. Magnificent. But it's actually, comfort in these dark times, as it were. But it was the one where Hacker's first weakest prime minister. And, one of the things he quickly finds out is that he actually hasn't got much to do with necessarily. Because he's got a department to run, he's not got loads of papers to sign, red boxes to do. But the second thing is, of course, he finds out that per se he doesn't have a great deal of power. Now, he has power, but the power can only be really wielded through influence and through the way he controls others. And if you think about it, the idea that prime ministers are all powerful, if you had that idea, you haven't been following British politics under Theresa May, have you? So, let's begin. Where does prime minister's power actually come from? Well, probably the most single solid power they have is what we call the crown prerogative. You'll remember a lot of argument about that in recent times, the power that a prime minister can wield. Well, that has its limits, as we've seen recently. The limits were much, I think, less so back in the day. And, he was really using things like the crown prerogative, for example, that Attlee launched Britain's nuclear programme. He can go a very, very long way. Another source of power was that created by Lloyd George, the Cabinet Office and the Cabinet Secretary. And that undoubtedly increased the power of the Prime Minister by enabling number 10 to cohere policy across departments, to keep an eye on what departments were doing, to kind of hold them to account, to do what they were supposed to be doing, and also to have a greater measure of control over his cabinets and the meetings his cabinets had. But again, there are many limits to that. Right? It's only a measure of control, and sometimes prime ministers find it very difficult to control their departments. A big majority in the Commons helps, yeah, definitely, of course it does. And we all know prime ministers with very small majorities or no majority at all find themselves very badly hemmed in. Just ask Theresa May. But then, when Margaret Thatcher fell, she had a majority of almost 100. So, doesn't guarantee anything. Probably the other great source of prime ministerial authority is patronage, the ability to hire and fire, i.e. to make you a minister and to sack you. And that undoubtedly is a great source of power and strength, and we'll see, prime ministers wield that shortly, particularly Macmillan. However, there are limits to that. Gordon Brown. Right? Tony Blair couldn't sack Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, just didn't feel it was politically possible. And of course, it's a weapon that can be wielded the other way. As we'll see, two ministerial resignations, a Chancellor and an ex-Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson, really helped bring about the end of Margaret Thatcher. And in the Night of the Long Knives, when Macmillan sacked a third of his cabinet, it actually in the end undermined Macmillan rather than strengthened him. I think it's fair to say, in virtually every post-war government, the key relationship is always between number 10 and number 11, between Prime Minister and Chancellor. There are a number of reasons for this. I mean, first of all, the Treasury is so important. It controls the purse strings. It's the single most powerful government department. The second is that, since the Second World War, economic policy has been at the centre of politics. So the Treasury, the department that makes economic policy, is inevitably central. And the Treasury has always taken its own view in a sense as well, and I think has always regarded itself as the sort of keeper of sound finance, sound policy. Often felt it has to resist bending departments and prime ministers who want to splurge money. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, does it? Um, the history of post-war Britain is therefore really littered with attempts by number 10 to rein in the Treasury or to overrule them, most of them unsuccessful in one way or another. So, all of 51 to 64. Well, we'll start with the first of the six chancellors, which was Rab Butler. Now, he's one of the great figures of Conservative history in this period, one of three men to have held the great offices of state: Home Secretary, Chancellor, and Foreign Secretary. And he was one of the architects of the party's recovery after 1945 and its victory in 1951. So Churchill knew he was going to have to give him a senior job. And Churchill also, of course, was a former Chancellor himself. Now, in one sense, I think here he's trying to exercise a degree of control, because Butler was no economist. He hadn't expected to be sent to number 11. He was a bit like when Churchill was sent to number 11. It was a surprise to him. And when he exclaimed, "Well, I'm not an economist," Churchill famously told him that he would have, quote, "the best economist since Jesus Christ to help him." The best economist since Jesus Christ, I don't recall actually having a great deal to say on economic policy or macroeconomic policy, was a man named Sir Arthur Salter, who was appointed a kind of Churchillian economic overlord. You can see, in a sense, an attempt there to sort of keep an eye on the Treasury. Churchill also had his own sources of independent economic advice, by the way. His old chum, Lord Cherwell, and an Oxford economist, Donald Dougal, very much advised the Prime Minister aside from number 11. When Butler enters number 11, he's entering in the teeth of a crisis. Sterling, as usual, is a problem, as was inflation. The Korean War was responsible for this, and I think whether it be Butler or Gateskill, Labour's Chancellor, remember, who had entered number 11 again, they would have had to introduce a serious measure of deflation. I think that was inevitable. Faced with this situation, with a Chancellor who's no economist and he's not a Keynesian, unlike quite a lot of other people were by this stage, the Treasury decided to try and bounce him into a serious measure of deflation in the form of what was called robot. Really an attempt to rip up, as I said before, post-war economic arrangements in the form of sterling. The idea was to float sterling, which I said is euphemism for letting it fall, and that would have to be accompanied by a serious measure of deflation. And that's really what they're trying to do, is bounce a new Chancellor into deflation. Let's all see this pattern recur again and again. Realistically, to be honest, a government with a very small majority of 13, haunted by the ghosts of the Hungry 30s, was never likely to be radical, and robot was still born. In a sense, the Treasury lost that round. And as Chancellor, Butler now became, I think, Mr. Buskillism. Yeah, he became a relatively, by now, what we think of as orthodox Keynesian Chancellor. The problem with being Keynesian Chancellors is you kept fiddling with the leaders. Now, he did some of the fiddling with the levers correctly. He raised interest rate and cut import quotas. There were import quotas in those days. Twice he did it. When he came in, he did it again the following year. And it succeeded. It did begin to rein in inflation. It did begin to deal with the balance of payments crisis. He found money as well. To pay for Macmillan's 300,000 new houses, for example. So, Butler had his successes, but the trouble with stop-go is it is deeply tempting. The go button has a political benefit. In 55, Churchill finally goes. Eden comes in, hugely popular, riding on the wave of an economic boom, political honeymoon, and he goes to the country in a snap election designed to give him a bigger election, bigger majority. He succeeds. To make sure he did, though, Butler gave him a go budget. Basically, £150 million worth of tax cuts. Sounds like nothing now, but it was a lot at that time. It was very good politics, if cynical. It was frankly irresponsible economics. And playing with fire gets you burned. Butler got burned. By the end of 55, a balance of payments crisis caused by sucking in imports from this inflating economy forced him to reverse almost all the tax cuts and deflate the economy. The political damage to him was immense. Eden, with all the gratitude one expects from a Prime Minister in these circumstances, sacked him and demoted him. And his arch-rival, Macmillan, got the Treasury. Macmillan wasn't there long, of course. Suez knackers Eden. And in 1957, Macmillan enters number 10. And I explained before, a politician that did understand economics. Edmund Dole famously said that Macmillan got through chancellors faster than Henry VIII got through wives, and with, quotes, even less satisfaction. 4 chancellors in 7 years of Macmillan's tenure. So here goes. First is Peter Thornycroft. Thornycroft is now principally remembered for the fact that he resigned the following year. And he inherited a real mess post-Suez, had to shore up sterling, so he introduced sharp cuts in spending that Macmillan actually had already been thinking of doing anyway, and hiked interest rates up, though he did introduce tax cuts. Thornycroft came to a particular economic belief that would lead him to disagree fundamentally with his Prime Minister. He is, in a sense, the first monetarist. He became convinced that the serious problem in the British economy was inflation, and that the root cause of inflation was an excessive money supply, literally too much money in the economy. The problem was Macmillan wasn't going to agree. Macmillan had his advisor Roy Harrod, who was very much a Keynesian. Macmillan, I think, was naturally sympathetic to Keynesianism. So were quite a bit of the Treasury by now, I think. And Thornycroft, therefore, found himself leaning on the academic Lionel Robbins, but then most of all his brilliant juniors, one in particular, a very famous brilliant junior, Enoch Powell, and the other Nigel Birch. Now, they disagreed over theory with number 10, but theory didn't really matter much. What mattered was spending. Nobody likes spending cuts, especially if you're the head of a great spending department. And thus it was spending ministers always fight their corner when it comes to the time for cuts. This particularly was the case in the form of Ian MacLeod, Health Secretary at the time and a rising star, and he would fight tooth and nail. To get cuts through, Thornycroft would need the support of number 10, and he didn't get it. The two men's relationship deteriorated quite quickly, and with Macmillan, of course, there's politics in it as well. If cuts were going to come, they were going to have to come in things that were unpopular. In the end, actually, Thornycroft resigned on quite a small amount, relatively speaking, £50 million worth of cuts, but I think it was symbolic of something else. He, Powell and Birch all went, and the reason was they were looking for a much deeper reconfiguration of policy towards a far more fiscally conservative, far more deflationary policy than Macmillan was ever going to tolerate. In short, this was beyond the political pale of Harold Macmillan. Faced with this situation, Macmillan basically made no attempt to keep his Chancellor. So there it is, 1 down, 3 to go. The next is wonderfully named Derek Heathcote Amory. Now, Macmillan famously dismissed the resignation of the 3 as a little local difficulty, well, of course it wasn't. And I think really this explains Heathcote Amory's appointment. He had a political crisis on his hands, and he needed a Chancellor that was going to be stable, also would support him, and also that would help him win an election, which was coming up at some point in the next couple of years. Famously, Edmund Dell describes Derek Heathcote Amory. By the way, the new Bible now is this one. Edmund Dell's The Chancellor's fantastic book. And he describes him as his master's voice. And basically, in the face of some political difficulties, some by-election defeats, Labour with a pretty big lead through 57, 58, Heathcote Amory is there to deliver the goods. In the early days, I think because he had to be seen to be cautious, he was cautious. He couldn't afford to be seen as throwing money around like confetti, because Thornycroft would be able to go in for that. Couldn't be seen to be doing what Thornycroft wanted either, so he kind of just hedges his bets. But by 58, 59, he's in full-on go mode, and the go is there for one simple reason, and it is to win the election. And it's a go at an entirely economically inappropriate time. The result is a budget that gives £300 million basically straight into voters' pockets. Tax cuts, cut the tax on goods, purchase tax, cuts on income tax, cuts on excise duties on beer. But, well, it's politically very successful. Majority of 100. Economically, it's just downright irresponsible. The Treasury had actually predicted a budget deficit of £750 million, the highest since the war. The result was, by 1960, everything's going to have to go in reverse. By that time, Heathcote Amory is having to cut spending. He's having to increase taxes, for example, increase higher purchase controls on bank loans, raise interest rates, and it's going to get worse. He knows he's going to have to deflate even further. That's why, possibly, he resigns. He retires, actually. He'd always said he would retire at 60, and actually I think for once this was a politician keeping his word. Rumours at the time were that he was running away from chickens coming home to roost, or even what we call a colourful personal life, what they used to call a confirmed bachelor, which meant, was he really gay? I don't think he was. I think the simple truth is, he wanted out. I think if he did have a double life was pretending to be a sensible Conservative Chancellor while chucking money at the economy. The root of the problem now was Macmillan, rather like Lady Bracknell. She famously says to lose one parent is unfortunate, to lose two might be deemed carelessness. Well, that's Chancellor number 2 gone. So he's now got to be seen to be even more uber sensible, and as such, his third Chancellor is Selwyn Lloyd. Selwyn was one of the more fascinating figures of this period. And Selwyn Lloyd is there primarily, I think, to steady the ship. Yes, to introduce a measure of serious deflation, but to try and do so in a way that doesn't do too much damage. He really knows he's up against it. But the first question he asks his permanent secretary when he gets into number 11 is, how soon are we going bust? It was half a joke, but it was only half a joke. The crunch came in July 61 when a run on sterling led the government to go to the IMF and borrow $1.5 billion. And that's a fortune at the time. And the IMF always extract their pound of flesh. In this case, it was in serious deflationary cuts, interest rates at 7%, £300 million worth of spending cuts. Deflation is on. At the same time, he sought to innovate. We mentioned NEDI before, the National Economic Development Council, NICI, the National Incomes Council. Neither really added up to much. And the only other big notice policy was pay restraint in the form of a public pay pause for public sector pay. Meanwhile, private sector pay went up anyway. Deflation had its effect. Public sector wage restraint has effect. The government felt the political chill. In March 62, the Liberals had a sensational by-election victory at Orpington. The 6th of June, Labour took Middlesbrough West. Labour were way ahead in the polls, as high as 20% in the end. The likes of Reb Butley, Ian MacLeod, Lord Hume, the Foreign Secretary, and the Cabinet Secretary himself, Sir Norman Brooke, actually all thought Lloyd's time had come. Macmillan had assured Lloyd it hadn't. He assured Lloyd he had his absolute backing. He'd even given him the use of Chequers, his country house. Macmillan had his own country house nearby. But as Macmillan would later say, there are no friends in politics. Many years later, when asked why his son was less successful in politics than him, and there were other reasons to do with drink problems and stuff, but Macmillan had said simply, excuse my French, that his son hadn't been enough of a shit. Macmillan, he said, was. And Macmillan showed that now. He sacked Selwyn Lloyd, 6 other cabinet ministers in what's called the Night of the Long Knives. In some ways, Selwyn Lloyd was deeply personally hurt. He'd married a much younger woman. They were divorced in 57. He was a deeply lonely man. He'd lost his career, his home, and even his much-loved dog, because he hadn't had a home for it. Macmillan, he knew, had privately referred to him as the middle-class lawyer from Liverpool. He was, in words of Edmund Dell, a chancellor betrayed. Which brings us to Reggie Maudling, number 4. Macmillan saw in Maudling, I think, a rising star, and saw a kindred spirit economically, a definite progressive, a definite Keynesian. Maudling is remembered for the dash for growth. That actually got started quite slowly because, in fact, again, they had to be pretty careful with the economy. Maudling was not dumb. He knew there were underlying problems in the British economy, but he knew there were much deeper underlying problems in the Conservatives' political prospects. And when unemployment peaked at 878,000, the time had come to splash the cash along with Orpington and all the other political difficulties the government faced. It didn't save Macmillan. Macmillan was replaced by Douglas Hume, but now the race was on to try and rescue the 64 election. And the economy was inflated in April 63 budget to the value of something like 460 million, a public sector borrowing requirement of 700 million, and it nearly worked politically. Labour's majority in 64 was just 4. In fact, of course, the Conservatives had nicked Labour's expansionist clothes. Labour couldn't say, we'll expand the economy, because they couldn't say, well, we're doing it anyway. Maudling had gambled. But the problem is, if Maudling lost, actually Labour almost lost worse, because when Callaghan comes into the Treasury, he's inheriting an awful financial mess. Something like a budget deficit of 800 million, the budget payments deficit of 800 million. In truth, Maudling was one of a succession of post-war Conservative Chancellors. We'll mention Anthony Barber, maybe Nigel Lawson as well, who played fast and loose with the public finances and left their successors with a hell of a problem. But politically, well, cynical go had actually worked pretty well. It's the antithesis of a stable economic policy. It's the antithesis of tackling the long-term problems of the country. But stop-go won elections.